Marcus Chen had always prided himself on being a rational man. A structural engineer by trade, he believed in concrete facts, load-bearing calculations, and the immutable laws of physics. So when he purchased the Victorian townhouse at 447 Elmwood Avenue for a fraction of its market value, he dismissed the realtor's nervous warnings about the basement room as superstitious nonsense. Previous tenants have reported difficulties, she had said, her manicured fingers drumming against her clipboard. The seller is legally obligated to disclose that 3 separate families have broken their leases after incidents involving the basement. Marcus had laughed it off. The house was perfect. 3 stories of period architecture, original hardwood floors, and a price that would leave him enough for extensive renovations. The basement room in question was small, perhaps 12 by 15 feet, with stone walls and a single narrow window near the ceiling. Nothing remarkable, except for the heavy iron door with its unusual lock mechanism that secured from the outside. He moved in on a Thursday afternoon in October, the autumn light already fading by 4 o'clock. The movers had been unsettled by the basement, refusing to store any boxes in the room despite the ample space. Marcus had to carry several containers down himself, noting how the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as he descended the wooden stairs. The room was empty save for strange markings on the floor, concentric circles carved into the stone, worn smooth by age. The walls bore no decoration, no shelving, nothing but cold granite that sweated condensation despite the dry weather. Marcus set his boxes against the far wall and paused, struck by an odd sensation. The air felt heavy here, pressing against his eardrums like the pressure before a storm. That first night, he heard it, a sound like breathing, slow and deliberate, coming from beneath the floorboards. Marcus told himself it was the old heating system, pipes expanding and contracting. But heating systems didn't pause when you held your breath, didn't match their rhythm to your own. By morning, he had convinced himself it was exhaustion from the move. He threw himself into unpacking, setting up his home office on the 2nd floor, arranging his engineering manuals and drafting tools. Yet his thoughts kept returning to the basement room. There was something wrong with the geometry of it. The corners didn't seem to meet at right angles, though his measuring tape insisted they did. Friday evening, he decided to investigate properly. Armed with a flashlight and his tablet for taking notes, Marcus descended into the basement. The iron door stood open as he'd left it. Inside, his boxes remained undisturbed, but something had changed. The carved circles on the floor seemed deeper, more pronounced. And in the center of the innermost circle, a dark stain had appeared. He knelt beside it, running his fingers over the mark. The stone was warm to the touch, feverish even. The temperature differential made no sense. Heat rises. It doesn't pool in basement floors. As he puzzled over this anomaly, the breathing sound returned, louder now, coming from directly beneath where he crouched. Marcus jerked back, his flashlight beam swinging wildly. The light caught something on the wall writing that hadn't been there before. Or had it? The marks were faint, possibly just mineral deposits from water damage. But they formed patterns that almost looked like words. The room, REMBRS. He left quickly, slamming the iron door behind him. The lock mechanism was fascinating. A series of interlocking gears and tumblers that seemed overly complex for a simple basement room. Why lock something from the outside? What were they keeping in? Sleep eluded him that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the sensation of being watched from below. The house settled around him with groans and creaks that sounded almost like footsteps on the basement stairs. At 3 a.m., he gave up and went to his office, burying himself in work until dawn. Saturday brought no relief. The basement door stood open when he went to check it, though he distinctly remembered locking it. The carved circles on the floor had definitely changed. They seemed to spiral now, creating an optical illusion that made him dizzy. The dark stain had spread, forming tendrils that reached toward the walls. He tried to leave the house to get some air and perspective, but found himself unable to go far. Every step away from 447 Elmwood felt wrong, like swimming against a riptide. By noon, he had given up and returned, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name. The boxes in the basement room had been opened. His engineering books lay scattered across the floor, pages torn out and arranged in patterns that hurt to look at. The equations and diagrams had been modified, twisted into impossible mathematical proofs that seemed to prove that parallel lines could meet, that circles could have corners, that down could be up. Marcus spent hours trying to understand the modifications. Part of his mind screamed that this was madness, but the engineer in him was fascinated. The math almost made sense if you just adjusted your perspective, if you accepted that reality was more fluid than he'd believed. By evening, he had filled 3 notebooks with calculations inspired by the vandalized textbooks. His handwriting grew increasingly erratic, the numbers and symbols morphing into shapes that resembled the carved circles on the floor he wasn't aware of when he started working in the basement room itself. Only that the stone floor was the perfect canvas for his expanding equations. The breathing beneath the floor had become his metronome, timing his fevered work. Sometimes he thought he heard voices in it, whispers in languages that predated words. They spoke of angles that led nowhere and everywhere, of spaces between spaces where things waited with infinite patience. Sunday arrived without his notice. Time had become elastic in the basement room. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours collapsed into seconds. The walls breathed with him now, expanding and contracting in rhythm with his heart. The carved circles had begun to rotate. Or perhaps it was the room itself that spun. Hunger and thirst were distant concepts. His body was merely a vessel for the understanding that flooded through him. The room was not a room at all, but an intersection, a point where the rigid laws of reality grew soft and malleable. Those who had been here before had left traces, not just the previous tenants, but others, older, who had discovered what waited in the spaces between. He found their records in the walls themselves, not written words, but impressions, psychic fossils pressed into stone by minds that had bent too far. A mother who had tried to feed her children to the breathing floor. A professor who had proven mathematically that he didn't exist. A child who had found doorways in the corners that led to places where geometry went to die. Marcus added his own story to the stone, using tools he couldn't remember finding. His equations had evolved beyond mathematics into something closer to music, a symphony of impossibility that described the true shape of the world. The basement room was simply a lens, focusing perception, until the comfortable lies of reality burned away. By Sunday night, he understood why the door locked from the outside. It wasn't to keep something in, but to keep the unprepared out. The room was a gift, a revelation, a beautiful cancer that consumed the boundaries between self and space. He had been wrong to fear it. The madness wasn't in the room. The madness was in thinking the world above was any more real. Monday morning found him standing in the center of the carved circles, his notebooks carpeting the floor around him. His phone had been ringing for hours, concerned colleagues, friends who hadn't heard from him. But their voices sounded thin and false compared to the breathing of the room. He knew what came next. The pattern was clear in the psychic fossils, in the stories pressed into stone. Someone would come looking. They would find him here, wild-eyed and rambling about angles and spaces. They would drag him out, lock the door, call it madness. But Marcus had moved beyond such limited thinking. The room had shown him the truth, that madness was simply a word for perception, unbound by consensus. He picked up his phone and typed a message to his emergency contact, his sister in Denver. The basement room at 447 Elmwood Avenue is a gift. Come see for yourself. The door locks from the outside for a reason. 24 hours is all it takes to understand. The room remembers everything. The room forgets nothing. The room is patient. I am patient now too. He sent the message and settled back into the center of the circles. The breathing beneath the floor synchronized with his own. Somewhere above, in the thin reality most people inhabited, Monday continued its ordinary course. But here in the basement room, Marcus Chen waited with infinite patience for the next visitor, the next mind to be opened to the beautiful mathematics of madness. The iron door swung gently on its hinges, neither open nor closed, but balanced perfectly between states, just like everything else in the room that drove its occupants mad in just 24 hours. Though Marcus now understood it wasn't madness at all. It was clarity. And clarity, true clarity, was the most terrifying gift of all. The room breathed. Marcus breathed. The circles turned, spiraling ever inward toward truth too large for sanity to contain. And in the stone walls, another story fossilized, waiting to whisper its warnings to whoever came next. 447 Elmwood Avenue stood silent in the October afternoon. Just another Victorian townhouse with a for sale sign in the yard. The realtor would come eventually, with her nervous warnings and legal disclosures. Someone else would dismiss the stories as superstition. The room could wait. The room had nothing but time, and somewhere beneath the floor, the breathing continued, patient as stone, certain as madness, eternal as the angles that led to spaces between spaces, where reality went to fold in on itself. Marcus Chen's notebook remained in the basement, filled with equations that proved the impossible. On the last page, a single line of text, written in a hand that no longer looked entirely human. Day 1, you hear the breathing. Day 2, you understand the breathing. Day 3, you become the breathing. Day 4, there is no day 4. There is only the room, the basement room at 447 Elmwood Avenue, waited for its next occupant. 24 hours was all it ever took. 24 hours to strip away the comforting lies of solid walls and straight lines. 24 hours to reveal that madness was just another word for seeing too much truth. The iron door hung open, an invitation and a warning. The room remembered everything. The room forgot nothing. The room was patient, and patience, in the end, was all it needed.